The pre-Columbian Americas contained some of the most sophisticated cultures in the world. In South America, the Inca Empire created one of the largest empires in the world, connected by roads which were constructed without the use of the wheel. In Central America, the Mayan cultures achieved one of the most comprehensive understandings of astronomy anywhere on Earth, even better than the ancient Greeks, for which many celestial bodies are named. But one area in particular stands out. The Valley of Mexico, site of present-day Mexico City, was once one of the most densely populated regions in the entire American continent. In fact, it still is. Mexico City is the second largest city in the Western Hemisphere. It's Sao Paulo, before you go and Google it, by the way. The area was one of the most diverse in the Americas, perhaps anywhere on Earth. Dozens of different Mesoamerican cultures lived in this area over the course of the centuries, interacting, trading, and warring. It was also in this region that some of the largest cities in the world emerged, including one that is often overlooked. This is the story of Teotihuacan, the ancient city that was once the largest in Mesoamerica. Before we get started, we need to make a disclaimer. Relatively speaking, Teotihuacan is one of the less well understood archaeological sites in Mesoamerica, and there's a significant number of details that are being debated by experts. A lot of the research that has been done is also decades old, and while that's not inherently a bad thing, a lot can change in 40 years. We'll be giving you an overview today of some of that research, but just do be aware that there's quite a bit of work going on behind the scenes. With that out of the way, though, let us begin. One of the most intriguing things about Teotihuacan is its name. Teotihuacan is not its own. The name comes from the Aztecs, who only emerged centuries after the city had fallen into ruin and they'd repopulated the area. Cities falling into ruin and being abandoned is surprisingly common in pre-Columbian Americas, so this isn't by itself anything particularly special, but it does mean that whatever the original name of the city was, it's been effectively lost to history. Now, with that in mind, the best we currently have are its Nahuatl or Aztec names. The conventionally accepted name, Teotihuacan, roughly translates to City of the Gods or Birthplace of the Gods. Now, that's not exactly right, but that's sort of just how translations go sometimes. They're rarely perfect. Some experts believe the city might have been called Teotihuacan, meaning City of the Sun, reasoning that the name might have changed to Teotihuacan by later Spanish colonists. Why they did that, or even whether they did that, is still subject to debate, like a lot of things about this place. For now, we'll call it Teotihuacan to keep things simple, except for its pronunciation. Moving on, the first human settlements in the area that would become Teotihuacan were established around 600 BCE, and it remains nothing but a collection of small villages for several hundred years, with an estimated population of around 6,000 people. A far cry from what it would later become, but well, we've got to start somewhere, don't we? Which Mesoamerican culture actually founded these villages, or indeed the later city, is also, surprisingly, debated. For a time, it was believed that the Toltecs had founded it, but that ultimately didn't pass the timeline check. The Toltecs only became powerful centuries after Teotihuacan had declined. Other suggestions have been put forward in their place, but ultimately the evidence on the ground is scant for most of them, and there's a big reason for that. More on that real soon. For now, the city began to take shape, starting in the year 200 BC, when more people began to settle down in the Teotihuacan Valley on the northeastern shore of Lake Texcoco. The current working theory for what happened next goes a bit like this. The early settlement of Teotihuacan was a rival of a lesser-known city called Cuculo, also situated near Lake Texcoco. But at one point, some sources say around 100 BC, other sources say around 300 AD, a nearby volcano, Ixtitl, erupted, which devastated Cuculco. More recent research suggests that there might have even been multiple eruptions from multiple volcanoes, but at the moment, we're just not certain. Whatever the case, there was probably an eruption, and it probably caused the land to become inhospitable enough for the inhabitants of Cuculco to migrate north towards Teotihuacan. These refugees then assimilated into the city's population, facilitating its initial growth as a settlement. Whether that theory is true or not, that initial story leads us into perhaps the single most interesting fact about Teotihuacan as a city, and the reason that it's so difficult to decipher who originally built it. Throughout its history, Teotihuacan was a migrant capital. For the longest time, human cities only managed to grow because of immigration, the net increase of new arrivals outstripping the natural deaths that came with so many people living in one place. Teotihuacan was this principle scaled to 11. A large portion of the new arrivals came locally from the Valley of Mexico, but there is also a plethora of archaeological evidence showing that people of many different cultures came to Teotihuacan to live and work in the city. So how do we know this? Well, archaeologists have used methods ranging from the old-fashioned, such as identifying the difference in art or architecture, to the complex, including isotope radio testing to determine if human remains were native to Teotihuacan or not. The result is a clear trend that many of the city's inhabitants were immigrants, and it was this constant influx of new people that allowed the city to grow despite the high mortality rates that came with lacking modern medicine. In at least one neighborhood, 4/5 of tested skeletons were found to have immigrated to the city from somewhere else. These new people came from all over Mesoamerica. That previous neighborhood was predominantly composed of people from the Oaxaca region of the Zapotec culture. There were also those of the Mixtec culture from Puebla and Oaxaca, as well as the Mayans further east in the Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala. The Mayans, in particular, are believed to have shared a special connection with Teotihuacan, with the city significantly influencing Mayan culture. This immigration hugely contributed to the explosive growth of the city between the turn of the millennium and 650 AD. Over this time period, the city grew to a population of anywhere between 60,000 and 125,000 people. This would have made it the largest city in Mesoamerica and one of the largest cities on Earth at the time. For context, the more famous Tenochtitlan was not founded until 1325, 7 centuries later. So, what were all these people doing? Well, they were living and working, just like anywhere else. It's believed that the various ethnic groups inhabiting the city lived in mostly segregated neighborhoods physically separated from each other. It's believed that the different ethnic groups spoke multiple languages, and as such, their interaction with each other was limited. Yet, they still interacted. Primarily, this took the form of exchanging goods and presumably services. This is evidenced by artifacts from other parts of the city being found in the different neighborhoods. The city was also divided in terms of class, with elites living in different parts of the city than workers. Now keep that point in the back of your mind because it's going to become important later in today's video. In economic terms, Teotihuacan was driven by agriculture, fed from the nearby Lake Texcoco and surrounding rivers, and growing things like maize, beans, and tomatoes. This was the primary industry, but there was also a healthy crafts community for various specialized work, including textiles, stone cutting, pottery, and most notably obsidian. Obsidian crafting is a well-studied facet of old Mesoamerican cultures, and Teotihuacan is believed to have been famous for it during its time, producing obsidian artworks, tools, and weapons. All of this gave the city a huge amount of influence, perhaps the most of any state in Mesoamerica until the Aztec Empire centuries later. Architectural styles native to the city can be found all over the region in the historic homelands of many different Mesoamerican cultures. Some scholars believe that this implies Teotihuacan styles were desirable enough to copy them, and it's understandable why. Monuments in the city were magnificent. Some of them remain to this day, including the Temple of the Feathered Serpent and the Pyramids of the Sun and the Moon. There's also some evidence to suggest that the city was militarily powerful as well. In the 1980s, hundreds of human sacrifices were found beneath the aforementioned Temple of the Feathered Serpent, and it's possible that they were captives taken from somewhere else in battle. What's more, some old Mayan inscriptions speak of a Teotihuacan ruler who installed relatives of his as lords of some Mayan cities as far south as Guatemala. That's a huge distance to project power over, meaning Teotihuacan's rulers must have had quite a large military. Now, it should be noted that this conclusion is rather dubious, as it comes from a source that may or may not be accurate. But there's another reason that may surprise you. You see, aside from that Mayan inscription, there is, at least so far, little evidence of a monarchy in Teotihuacan or a similar type of government where power was concentrated in one individual. In other words, Teotihuacan might not have been a monarchy at all. Of course, correlation doesn't equal causation, or that just because we can't find sufficient evidence of a monarchy doesn't mean there wasn't one. This is the same reason we can't assume the city didn't have a military just because we can't find military buildings like walls or fortifications. But contemporary cultures, including Mayan cities, did have such evidence, making its absence in Teotihuacan all the more conspicuous. It's enough of a salient point for experts to hypothesize that the city might have been ruled by some kind of collective governance, which would have been very unique for Mesoamerica and indeed the rest of the world. So to recap, one of the largest cities in the world, consisting of migrants from all over the region with huge cultural impact and possibly even lacking a monarchy. Next, you'll tell me that they were communist or something. Teotihuacan is undeniably one of the most interesting chapters in the history of Mesoamerica, even, as it seems, in how it came to its end. Teotihuacan reached the zenith of its power in the 5th and 6th centuries, but after this period, the city began to decline until it suddenly rapidly depopulated and was abandoned. Again, cities in the pre-Columbian Americas were abandoned quite often, relatively speaking. But what happened to Teotihuacan? There's a few answers, as the precise details are not known for sure. For the longest time, it was believed that the city was invaded, sacked, and burned. There was evidence on the ground showing that something like this did happen. But this is where things get interesting. Upon closer inspection, the buildings that had received the most damage were specifically the buildings where the city's elite resided. The workers' neighborhoods, by contrast, showed little of the same evidence. In other words, this wasn't an invasion. It was an uprising. But why? What had been going wrong? As we said before, there's evidence that Teotihuacan had started to decline in population at the start of the 6th century, meaning people either stopped coming or even started leaving. One theory names climate change as the reason for this. In the years 535 to 536 CE, it's believed that a massive volcanic eruption took place somewhere on Earth, possibly in El Salvador, causing global temperatures to drop sharply. This might have caused a severe crunch in agriculture through droughts and other extreme natural phenomena causing unrest. Further evidence to support this theory has been found in skeletal remains of young people who apparently suffered from malnutrition. Other explanations go that Teotihuacan started to see new regional rivals competing with the city for dominance. This might have caused prospective migrants to seek other areas, and Teotihuacan being a migrant city, this would have been understandably a big problem. Whatever the true story is, it seems likely that much of Teotihuacan was destroyed in the 6th century, and though it continued to be inhabited afterwards, it would never again reach the power that it once had. But the city didn't die. Though it was no longer powerful, it was still believed to be important to the cultures of the Valley of Mexico in accordance with the legacy of the once great city. One culture in particular may have found that legacy compelling: the Aztecs. In the 13th century, migrants repopulated the area around the city, pulling it under the sway of the growing Aztec cities on the western shore of Lake Texcoco. The Aztecs may have identified the former city as the location where the gods created the universe, and they gave it the name it is known by today. For the next few centuries, the city was a place of pilgrimage, with Aztec rulers believed to be making regular journeys to the city in accordance with religious duties, until in 1519, when a small Spanish ship appeared off the coast of Veracruz. And the rest, as they say, is history.